edition of Ask an Astronomer. I'm here on a very sunny day on the unceded territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh. I'm back from vacation, but of course, as we usually do, Marley is on her vacation, so you'll be sure to join us in a couple weeks for Marley to be back. But today we have a special guest astronomer all the way over from Newfoundland, from the University, the Memorial University, and that is Hilding Neilson from the Department of Astrophysics or Physics and Astronomy out there. Hi, Hilding, how are you?
I'm great. How are you doing?
Not too bad. Thanks so much for joining us. We are going to get into a very special topic. I saw you speak on this topic earlier this year at Langara College, looking at the skies from an Indigenous point of view. And I thought that would be a great topic for today. But before we get into that, why don't you tell us a little bit about some of the work that you do, some of the research that you do out at Memorial?
Well, yeah, it'd be a great pleasure. My name is Hilding Neilson. I'm a professor at Memorial University, where I work on stellar astrophysics. I'm very interested in how stars live, how they're born, and how they die. And so I work with my students and my team to do fun experiments using observations like linear polarization, like putting sunglasses on your telescope, or spectra to try to understand the weird things that stars get to do, because every star tells a story.
Yeah. I was actually just doing a presentation for some grade 10s today, kind of like that stellar cycle, the birth and death of stars, and looking at supernovae and looking at the spectra of them. Is there anything fun in the research out there about some of that study?
Well, one of the things we're doing with spectra and polarization, looking at a particular star called VCAN-Van in the Northern Hemisphere. And it's a really old star, the red giant, and it does funny things like that its polarization changes as does its light. And we don't understand how those things work together. So we think it's a star that's moving through space really quickly, has a giant wind, and maybe that wind is varying. So it's like ejecting shells of material into this kind of bow shock, almost like a ship going through the water, dumping material in front of it.
Yeah.
And it's just really weird what's happening.
Yeah, cool. Awesome. So if, of course, if you're out there watching on YouTube land or on Facebook and you want to get into any of these topics, and Hilding's going to get into this very special presentation about the nighttime sky from a very specific perspective. So if you have questions about that, put them into the chat and I'll aggregate them and we'll ask Hilding at the end. And of course, you're open to ask any question you'd like. We'll be going for another half an hour. So Hilding, take us away into your presentation.
All right, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be with you all tonight, or today, my night, your day. And hopefully this works, because every time I do Zoom, something blows up in my face, like this. Now you're going to see my talking backwards, apparently. There we go. So what I want to talk to you today is something very important, very special to me. And this idea is that space is part of the land, capital L land. And part of this reason this is important to me is because I'm Mi'kmaq, and the Mi'kmaq are the first peoples of what's today called Eastern Canada, Northeastern United States. But wherever we are on these lands, Indigenous peoples have been in here forever, since time immemorial, whether it is on Musqueam territory, Salish territory, Cree, Anishinaabe, Dakota, and so on. Indigenous peoples have been everywhere on these lands. And that's kind of important, because that means wherever we walk, we're on Indigenous territories. As we can see in this map of what is today Canada, every part of this land has some relationship with people. And being on these lands since time immemorial tells us that people had a chance to have a beautiful, intimate relationship with the night sky. Just imagine generations of people sitting under the stars telling stories again and again, observing the night sky, seeing the changes in the night sky, like supernova 1,000 years ago, or supernova maybe 5,000 years ago, who knows, and having that recorded in the oral traditions. So being Indigenous on these lands means that there are stories and knowledges of the night sky from being viewed on these lands. And why I think that's important is because we can explore the land through astronomy, because the stories depend on where we are. The stories someone might tell in Mi'kmaq and what's today Newfoundland or Nova Scotia is going to be very different than someone in the Arctic versus someone in Vancouver today. And so we learn a lot through astronomy this way. Just think about it this way. How do our stories change if we're in Australia or the Arctic? Just to pick two extremes. You know, it might not be obvious off the top of your head, but one thing is the moon. You know, we see the phases of the moon in the northern hemisphere one way. You know, the new moon with this arc to the right and growing, and then growing brighter till full moon, and then dimming again. On the southern hemisphere, it goes the other way around. The new moon comes from a different side. So our stories are going to be very different. That's very important because that's our view of the United Sky then is related to where we are on the land. The reason why that's important is because we start thinking about this through indigenous knowledges. Now, I'm using the phrase indigenous knowledges, but there is no one indigenous knowledge system. You know, there's Musqueam knowledge, there's Cree knowledge, there's Blackfoot knowledge, you know, and so on. Every nation has its own perspective. Every people has its own perspective, whether that's Aztec or Incan or wherever you want to talk about, you know, Cherokee, so on. And these kind of ideas could be thought of in terms of axioms. Now, what that means in terms of axioms might be a bit of a glib word, but it's just general ideas that have some common threads across many indigenous nations. So, for instance, what is above is reflected below. You know, the night sky is a reflection of the land. Knowledge is a relationship. It's something you do, not something you have. It's not just a diploma. It's how you use it, how you interact with it, and the relationships that come with it. Many indigenous nations think about science through multiple variables interacting concurrently. You know, when I teach first year physics, we'll do the experiment of gravity and try to have students understand what the force of gravity is by doing experiment. And so you're isolating how quickly or the time it takes a ball to drop to the ground and to measure the acceleration. And you're isolating all the other components of gravity, like the mass of the ball. You're holding it constant. But for indigenous peoples, you're thinking about how all these things interact, which is kind of important in a different way. For instance, the Innu peoples who live around the caribou herds, they know how to track the migration of the caribou herds, which is something that science has a lot of trouble doing because there are just so many variables that go into predicting the path of which the caribou herd will travel every year. And that path will change. It will have many different criteria, and we don't know all of them. But the knowledge keepers, the elders, they know how to not only predict where the caribou will go, they know how to manipulate the path. And so that is a way of intuitively understanding all these multiple variables. Knowledge is holistic. Now, when we talk about something being holistic, sometimes we think about it kind of spiritual, and that's part of it. It's also holistic in that it's everything. You know, I work in a university. I work in a physics department. Across the street's the math department. Over yonder is the engineering faculty. You know, we're all kind of separated doing our own thing. But indigenous knowledge, it doesn't have those boundaries. It's holistic in that it covers everything. And most importantly, knowledge is familial. Nature and knowledge are both familial. Nature is our relations. The caribou, the fish, the insect, the worm, they're cousins. They're our kin. And that's important to recall that, because that impacts how we see the world and how we see the universe. And that can drive a whole other way of seeing science that we don't necessarily see in the traditional Eurocentric, Western, whatever you want to call it, sensibilities that we use today. So let's think of some examples. So one example comes from the southern United States. This is the sun dagger. Now, this is in a Chaco Canyon, where in the desert, in a mountain, there's a small cave. In the back of the cave is this drawing here. Now, this image is taken at multiple times. So there's like three images overlaid here. So you think of each of the large kind of light spears as one image each. And overlaid to the entrance were three stones. And those stones block the light like a lens. So that depending on when the sun rose, you'll get the dagger or light dagger at different parts of the image on the back, the spiral pattern. And that tells you whether it is a solstice or an equinox. So this very simple drawing and geometry is a calendar. But more so, the spiral is also telling you about is a map of the region, tells you about which way you're traveling and how to get there. So the sundial is one example of indigenous knowledges in practice. Another one comes from the Arctic. If you're in the high Arctic and you're looking in the night sky, this might be the map you see. Here are the cardinal directions. On the bottom is south, top is north. And because we're looking in the night sky, east and west are a little bit backwards. You might recognize some of the stars here. You might see the Big Dipper. You might recognize Orion in there as well. But one star I want you to have a look for is called Sigurd, which I apologize. I know I'm almost sure I'm mispronouncing pretty badly. But this star is close to the southern horizon. It is the flickering star. And in the story, that is told by some Inuit, is that it is two foxes, one red fox and one white fox, chasing each other's tail in circles. The reason why this star has a value is because depending on how much is flickering, it can predict the weather. The flickering is caused by the light from the star coming through the atmosphere of the Earth. So if it flickers more, there's more atmosphere or pressure system. And so this is actually a weather indicator that you complements under the wind patterns, the snow patterns, the water flows, and all other things around the environment around people. But this is a star used for predicting weather. So stories have many purposes. That's one of my favorite from where I'm from. It's called Mion and the Seven Bird Hunters. And this story tells us a lot about nature and our place in it. In this story, it is about the hunt of the bear. Bear is Mion, and the seven bird hunters are robin, chickadee, gray jay, passenger pigeon, blue jay, saw-whet owl, and barn owl. And they're trying to hunt the bear because the bear in our land is a source of food, its fat is a source of medicine, and its fur is a source of warmth. But we tell the story throughout the whole year. We don't tell it over one night, because over one night, the Big Dipper goes around the North Star every night. But if we tell the story at the same time every morning, and we tell it throughout the year, that circular pattern will repeat. And that's kind of telling us a lot about what's going on. Now, we tell the story around 5 in the morning, not my cup of tea, maybe it's yours. I'm more of a night person. But we start in the spring, and around 5 in the morning, Mion is pointed straight down. At this point, Mion is emerging from hibernation after a long winter. And if you slept for about a few months, you'd probably be hungry too. So Mion is starting to look for food. When Mion is spotted by Robin, and Robin knows Mion will feed the community and his fatwood medicine and so on. So Robin grabs his bow and arrow and calls his friends. Chickadee flies up quickly with his pot. And if you look closely, the second star is actually 2 stars because it's Chickadee and his pot. And then followed again by the other birds. And they begin the hunt throughout the spring and into the summer as Mion is running across the land to escape. The birds are doing their best to keep up, but the summer is long and it's hot. And, as we move towards the fall, the owls have fallen away from the hunt because they're below the horizon at this point. But, everyone's getting tired and Mion is getting frustrated. So Mion in the fall gets on her hind legs and growls and tries to defend herself, and Robin sees his chance. Robin fires his bow and arrow, striking Mion in the chest. Blood goes everywhere, covering Robin. Robin flies into the trees to shake it all off, staining the leaves red, except for one spot on Robin's chest. Mion, dies, and Chickadee catches up, and the other birds catch up, and they begin to celebrate. They build a fire. They tell stories. They share food. They share medicine, and they keep doing this throughout the winter as Mion is in the sky waiting to return. But this story tells us so many different things. It tells us about how to behave in nature, how to approach the bear and when to hunt the bear, and how to behave in community. And so when we apply these indigenous knowledges to the story, we see all kinds of lessons. Above reflects below is the story is a reflection of nature. The relationship is how we work with the animals. Different variables tells us the motion of the stars at different times of the year, for instance. The knowledge is holistic. It's about community, astronomy, biology, and so on. And it's familial because the birds and Muon are our kin. So the story is its own science. So these stories provide valuable insights into our universe and our place in it. But where it's very important to come together is acknowledge that academic astronomy or academic physics has tended to ignore them. You know, when I teach an astronomy course, I'll have a book, it's like this thick. It'll have stars and cosmology and supernova, but it won't have indigenous knowledges. And if it does, it'll most likely be talking about the heads in Rapa Nui or Easter Island or Stonehenge, or a little bit of both. But these stories don't appear. And this is the problem because this is linked to colonization on these lands. This is the story of Mi'kmaq, but we don't tell the story everywhere. We don't see it in our textbooks. We don't see it in our star maps. The story we see is something very different. We see the bear with the tail. We see Ursa Major. And that's not a reflection of the land. I don't know about you, but I have never seen a bear with a tail. I've looked around, went to museums, they never have one. I watched Winnie the Pooh. Winnie the Pooh does not have a long tail, but Ursa Major does. And its story has relevance in Greek culture, in early Greek and Roman cultures, because it's a story of the gods in that land, but it's not a story of our lands. And so those stories have been colonized away. As such, our view of the night sky has become colonized. Where are not just the Mi'kmaq stories, but the Musqueam stories and Salish stories? Where are the stories of the Inuit? Where are the stories of the Lakota? And how do we bring them back into our teaching and our learning? But it's not just that the stories are rewritten. The stories are being erased. This is the map of the world from a satellite at night, when they stitch it together from the satellite. And you see all this beautiful dots of light coming into the sky from cities, whether it is Vancouver on the west coast of North America, St. John's where I'm at on the east coast of North America, from London and Paris, and all around the world. You can see the Nile River, and it's a beautiful image. What is light pollution? This is light that's escaping. It's not being used. It's not a resource. It's waste. This light is garbage. And this is also a form of colonization because it erases our night sky. I used to live in Toronto, and the joke when I was living in Toronto, I would be more likely to see stars on the street than I would be to see stars in the night sky, if Canadian stars exist. But that's kind of the reality of living in an urban area, wherever you are. And for many Indigenous peoples, and there are many urban Indigenous peoples, light pollution is a part of that disconnection. As you can see here in these two images, the one on the left is the night sky with minimal light pollution. On the right is the sickly orange night sky, hiding the beauty of the stars and our ancestors and our connections. And that's a huge loss. So in my short talk, I just want to give back this kind of thought is, what do we need to change? What do we give back to space in the night sky? Because so much of our knowledge and our work today, whether it is astronomy, which is taking photons and turning into knowledge, which is great, but we're taking from the night sky, or going to the moon for resources is taking from the moon. Instead of what do we take? What do we give back? Instead of what do we get from this exploitation, is what are we giving back to the world and what is our relationship to the night sky and space and the moon and Mars and all these great things that are coming up in the next few decades. And I think we need to work on minimizing light pollution. Looking for our stories. The stories are important. It's not just the raw knowledge, but the stories contain parts of ourselves in them. We need to include Indigenous knowledges and methods. And, I'm going to be a little maybe out there in your mind. I think we need to acknowledge that space, outer space, and the moon and Mars all have their own rights. we might think of space as something empty, a vacuum. It isn't really, but it doesn't have a right to be a vacuum. It doesn't have a right to be not exploited, perhaps. So how do we interact with these things in a way that isn't about us, but about that relationship? So thank you very much, Wilalia, and I hope we have a great conversation. So I will turn off sharing if that's okay, and
Absolutely.
hopefully I can turn off sharing.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Hilding. That was wonderful. I love hearing these stories, and I love hearing new stories that I've never heard before. And that story that you told, it's a Mi'kmaq story of the robin, and that makes all so much sense. Every time that it's embedded in our planetarium. When we turn on the constellations, and we have kind of like a variety of different kinds of constellations that we can show, but when we bring up Ursa Major, it does bring up, that full tail and the legs. And of course, it never made any sense to me. And I think for a lot of kids that don't see those full stars, and when they see sort of like that shape, it doesn't make much sense to them either. But it continues, and it's embedded in the programs. Like, even if you go on to any astronomy program and you bring up these constellations, it's going to bring up those constellations, because those are the recognized ones by the IAU. But is there a way here at the planetariums, and of course like in universities, if we can start to kind of like break away from that? That's something that I think about a lot, and I wonder if you do that in your own teaching as well.
Yeah, I mean, it was worth noting that the 88 constellations were something that were agreed to about a century ago now by a group of astronomers in Europe when they were organizing the first International Astronomical Union. Mm-hmm. And it was done by a committee, a French man, a British man, and a German man. Now, I would keep going on, but it might be a bad joke.
Yeah.
And so I think that's where we're coming from in this kind of night sky of the 88 constellations. If we want our stories, and some of them are out there, if you use a software like Stellarium, you can see some of these Inuit constellations, you can see some of the Cree and Ojibwe constellations. But it's about engaging with communities and knowledge keepers, and and learning from them. And then maybe bringing in artists into working with our planetarium softwares, mm-hmm. To bring these images that we can overlay in the night sky, and we can have those stories recorded, if protocol allows, in a way that can be shared and utilized by both community and settlers. And it's a lot of work, but there are groups that are beginning this. There's groups in McMaster, in Hamilton, groups in Hawaii, and elsewhere that are doing some of this already.
Yeah, great. So if you're out there, of course, on YouTube or Facebook, and you want to ask Hilding a question, we've got about 7 more minutes left with him. I'm curious about you and how you got into, becoming a professor in a very sort of like established nature. Like the universities are part of like the system of classical knowledge, right? But you're coming at this, bringing your own upbringing in and bringing these other specific stories. So before we get into that, I'm curious, like, what got you like into kind of like thinking about space in a way that you wanted to like, delve into it and eventually become like a professor now at Memorial?
So, most of my education is very much in the traditional Canadian sense, high school, and I went to university, and I was going to be an engineer.
Yeah.
Of all the things in the world, I could be engineer. I wasn't very imaginative, I guess. But I went to university, and the university I went to didn't have the engineering program that I can get into. Mm-hmm. So I picked up an astronomy course, and you start going through the textbook, and you start seeing question after question after question, like, we don't know how some stars die. We don't know what dark matter is. We don't know what dark energy is. Astronomy could be really, really written as the science of I don't know. Mm-hmm. And that's what got me, because it is the ultimate mystery. And I kind of like those mystery novels. It's like Agatha Christie, on drugs, and it's just so amazing. And that's really where I got into it. And then started taking more physics, I got to do some research after a couple of years working with colleagues on looking at the interstellar medium and trying to do a mapping of it. So I started learning programming. You start learning skills, and it just builds up and up and up, and you just really get into it. And then I had the opportunity to go to grad school and do all this stuff. So yeah, I wish I had a more romantic story, because I grew up in a small town. I saw, for me, the night sky was part of my life. For me to not see the stars was actually kind of the surprise, more of the surprise than the other way around.
Yeah. And then how did like your knowledge of the Mi'kmaq knowledge, like how did that become part of like your own knowledge? Like, did you grow up around these stories? Did you have people telling them to you, or is that something that you delved into later in life?
Didn't have so much of the stories growing up. We're Mi'kmaq, but we're in western coast in Newfoundland.
Yeah.
It's very much a settler community. There wasn't a whole lot of the stories told, and not a whole lot of the knowledge was available. And so it's something that really I came to more later in life, particularly as I was working as a professor in Toronto for a while. And when I had the chance to really start teaching courses of my own, I was teaching like history of astronomy, which was Greek history to the Enlightenment, so Isaac Newton to Einstein to today. And it was this linear path that just ignored 90% of the world. And I started thinking about, well, where was the Mi'kmaq knowledge? Where was the Cree knowledge? Why isn't that discussed? And then, so I started learning more about the Mi'kmaq knowledge and hearing more about the Cree knowledge and more about Anishinaabe and so on, and learning bits here and there wherever I could. And it's still a journey. Like I still feel like I've only scratched the surface.
Yeah, wonderful. One question I'm interested in, because over here with the Musqueam, the Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people, and when we talk to educators here and we hear about their knowledge, they're very, very connected to this very specific land, which is, by the ocean. You have a lot of ocean stories. You have a lot of forest stories. We, of course, are very much into that, which is not that dissimilar to, the geography out east. And I'm always curious because we don't often associate a lot of their stories with the stars out here. We're working with a few people here, local people, about their stories. For your stories out there, like how are there specific ones that kind of like connect, sort of like the ocean and the land and the stars in this way? Because we live in this, on these coasts that are kind of like have all of the environment around us. And I'm wondering if there's something specific that ties all those together for you.
Well, there's the stories of the moons. So in Mi'kmaq, there's the stories of the 12 moons of the year, and they're all associated with different times of year. So you'll have like frog croaking moon or ice cracking moon, depending on where you are. So there's that connection there. And then the stories of Glooskap, which is for many cultures would have what you might call a trickster. That might be one way of describing Glooskap, which talk about the land and the creation of areas in Nova Scotia. So we have some of those elements of that. I don't know them all, but but there's definitely that relationship and locality of a lot of the knowledge that comes into play.
Yeah, and that brings up a question from the chat. Yara asks about a source for possible Indigenous astronomy information, names of constellations. And of course, that's going to be specific to a variety of different kinds of stories. But what are some of the sources that you recommend for people?
Yeah, so I guess the quickest one is I have a short list on Medium. So if you Google me on medium.com, you can find this list of different Indigenous astronomy knowledges and sources, and that'll give you links or give you references to stories from Wilfred Buck, who's a Cree astronomer, Nat Lee, who's Ojibwe Dakota, and so on. And that'll give you some of that information.
Wonderful. Yeah, we've worked with Wilfred Buck before. He's a wonderful storyteller and has been a powerhouse all across this country. I think every time I go into any space museum or planetarium, I always see his name pop up somewhere. He's been doing some really great work over the past few years. Hilding, thank you so much for joining us out there. in Newfoundland. If people want to learn more about you, you've got, of course, got a website I can linked into here into the show description. Is there anything else that you want to point people towards?
No, I think the website is a great place to go, and and hopefully I'll have a chance to connect with your audience.
Awesome. For everyone out there, thank you so much for joining us for another edition of Ask an Astronomer. We are going to be back here, same time and same channel in 2 weeks, and that is going to be June the 15th. Marley and I will be here. Until then, take care, everyone.